Stepmother takes stepdaughter to the mall but leaves without noticing. But when the father arrives, he does something unexpected. Kathleen had always been a lively girl, with a dreamy gaze and boundless energy. Her caring personality made her always seek closeness with those she loved, expressing affection through small gestures and sweet words. However, behind her joy, there was an emptiness that she didn't fully understand yet. Since her mother passed away, her father, Brandon, became her safe haven, the person in whom she placed all her trust and love. He was always present, doing his best to make his daughter feel protected, but he knew that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't completely fill the need for a maternal figure in the girl's life. That was why, when Brenda entered their lives, Brandon hoped her presence would bring balance and complete the family. Brenda arrived with a kind heart and the sincere intention of taking care of Kathleen. She didn't want to replace the girl's mother in any way, but rather to build her own bond based on trust and affection. From the very beginning, she made an effort to get closer, helping Kathleen with her studies, joining in her play, and trying to be a positive presence in her life. Slowly, small moments together began to create a connection between them, though in a subtle way. However, Brenda had a demanding work routine, and although she wanted to be present, exhaustion often consumed her. Unknowingly, there were days when her attention to Kathleen wasn't what she would have liked, and moments when the girl longed for her presence went unnoticed. Life in Brandon's house followed a steady rhythm. He dedicated himself to his daughter with unconditional love, and Brenda tried within her possibilities to build a relationship with Kathleen. The girl, in turn, watched everything with attentive eyes, still uncertain about what to feel toward her stepmother. There was no rejection, but there was also no strong enough bond to trust completely. Even so, there was progress. Small gestures indicated that with time, that relationship could strengthen. Brenda tried to balance her professional responsibilities with family life, but she couldn't always dedicate as much time to Kathleen as she would have liked. Brandon, on the other hand, saw his wife's effort and believed that with patience, things would fall into place. The most important thing for him was that Kathleen knew she wasn't alone, that she would always have someone around. And in a way, that seemed enough. That day seemed ordinary, but it carried an invisible weight for Brenda. From the early hours of the morning, her phone had not stopped vibrating, with messages and emails arriving constantly, and her mind was consumed with an unexpected problem that required an immediate solution. Her expression was one of constant worry, and the tension in her shoulders betrayed the accumulated stress. As she prepared a cup of coffee, she glanced at the clock every few minutes, calculating the time needed to resolve everything. She knew she had to leave. She needed to go to the mall to resolve an urgent matter. The idea of postponing it didn't cross her mind. It had to be dealt with now. In the corner of the room, Kathleen was absent-mindedly playing with her favorite teddy bear, gently rocking it in the air while murmuring little words in her imaginary game. The soft sound of the television filled the room, but her attention was divided between her play and Brenda's hurried movements as she walked back and forth, phone glued to her ear, a tense expression on her face. Brenda, completely absorbed in her worries, held the phone tightly, her brow furrowed as she listened to the voice on the other end of the line. As soon as the call ended, she let out a heavy sigh and ran her fingers through her hair, clearly annoyed. "I need to go to the mall now," Brenda said aloud, more to herself than to anyone specific, but Brandon, who was sitting on the couch reading some papers, immediately lifted his gaze. "What happened?" he asked, setting the papers aside. "A work problem," Brenda replied impatiently. "Something that can't wait. I need to resolve it as soon as possible." Kathleen, who had been swinging her little feet while holding her teddy bear, immediately stopped. Her eyes lit up upon hearing the word mall. That was one of her favorite places to visit. The colorful store windows, the toy-filled shops, the wide and well-lit hallways, the sweet smell of popcorn in the air. Her heart began to race with sudden excitement. "Can I go with you?" Kathleen asked, quickly getting up and approaching Brenda, holding her teddy bear close to her chest. Brenda looked at the girl for a brief moment, but soon returned to checking her phone, as if processing the question automatically. "Kathleen, not today," Brenda said, already exhausted, pressing her fingers to her temples. "I'm not going for fun. I have to resolve a problem. I don't have time for distractions." Kathleen furrowed her brow and pressed her lips together, thoughtful. Even so, she didn't give up. "But I promise I won't get in the way," Kathleen said, moving closer and lightly tugging on Brenda's shirt. "We can walk around a little afterward, just a little." "Kathleen," Brenda said, impatient, trying to control her irritation, "I'm just going to take care of something for work. It'll be quick. I'll be back soon." The girl's enthusiasm faded for a moment, but she didn't give up. "But I really wanted to go." Kathleen's voice was soft, full of hope. "Can we have ice cream afterward?" Brenda sighed deeply and massaged her forehead. Her mind was already overloaded, and the girl's insistence made her more anxious. Deep down, she knew taking her would mean one more task, but before she could deny it altogether, Brandon, who had been silently watching the conversation, decided to intervene. "Brenda, why don't you take her?" Brandon said calmly, looking at his wife. "It'll be quick and she'll love to get out for a bit." "Brandon..." Brenda hesitated, still weighing if it was a good idea. "It won't make a difference to you," Brandon said with a slight smile. "She just wants to be with you. It'll do her good." Brenda fell silent for a moment, assessing the situation. Her mind screamed that she needed to resolve everything quickly, that her priority was work. But then she looked at Kathleen, who held her teddy bear with such expectation in her eyes, waiting for a positive answer. "Fine," Brenda said with a long sigh. "But you have to behave, okay? No running around or asking to go into every store." Kathleen let out a little squeal of joy, her face lighting up with happiness. "I promise," Kathleen said, running to her room and coming back in seconds with her teddy bear squeezed even tighter in her arms. "I'm ready," Kathleen said, full of enthusiasm. Brenda gave a small smile, though her mind was still far away. She grabbed her purse, adjusted her hair, and headed to the car with Kathleen, unaware that this would be a day that would change everything. After a few minutes, they arrived at the mall, which was crowded. People walked quickly. The lights of the store windows flickered in vibrant colors, and the sound of voices mixed with the ambient music. Kathleen held Brenda's hand tightly while looking around, enchanted by everything. "Look, the toy store," Kathleen said, pointing to a window full of dolls and stuffed animals. Brenda, however, didn't pay attention. She walked quickly, focused on what she needed to do. She checked her phone constantly, made calls, and mentally noted what she needed to resolve. "Brenda, can we look at the toys just for a little bit?" Kathleen asked, trying to keep up with her stepmother's quick pace. "Later, Kathleen. Not now," Brenda said, without even looking at the girl. Kathleen lowered her head for a moment, but then returned to admiring the store windows as they walked. Her little hand clutched her teddy bear tightly, as if it could accompany her on this busy journey. With each new store they entered, Brenda seemed more impatient. The problem still wasn't resolved, and her mind was growing further away from the girl by her side. Then, in a moment of distraction, while walking through a wide corridor, Kathleen saw something that made her eyes sparkle. In a store window, a huge toy castle was on display, full of small details that made the girl lose herself in her imagination. She stopped for a few seconds, enchanted, carefully observing every part of the intricately assembled model. "Wow," Kathleen whispered to herself, fascinated. And in that brief moment, everything changed. When she looked to the side again, Brenda was no longer there. The girl's smile vanished. Her heart skipped a beat. She quickly spun around, searching for that familiar face among the crowd. "Brenda!" Kathleen called, her voice trembling. Nothing. She looked around again. People rushed by, stores lined the sides, but her stepmother had disappeared. "Brenda!" Kathleen called again, louder, her voice now filled with desperation. Her eyes began to well up with tears. Her small hand gripped the teddy bear even tighter. She began to walk, then run. The mall, once a magical place full of life, suddenly felt frightening. The voices around her became unbearably loud, the hallways seemed endless, and fear began to fill her chest. "Brenda!" Kathleen shouted, but her voice was lost in the noise. Her heart raced. She tried to remember where she had been, trying to find any familiar landmark, but everything seemed the same. Her legs began to shake. She wanted to cry, wanted to call for her dad, wanted someone to help her. But all she could do was hold her teddy bear tightly against her chest and keep walking, lost among unfamiliar faces, desperately hoping to find Brenda again. Meanwhile, Brenda hurried through the mall's corridors, her mind completely absorbed in the problem she needed to solve. Her gaze shifted from her phone to the windows, calculating her next steps. She needed to buy what she came for, resolve the issue as quickly as possible, and head back home. Time was short, and every second wasted only increased her anxiety. She entered and exited stores, examined products, checked details, and made mental notes. Everything seemed to be running according to plan, and despite the constant discomfort in her mind, she felt she was close to wrapping things up. She walked decisively, unaware that just a few corridors away, Kathleen was living one of the most terrifying moments of her life. The little girl, lost among strangers and completely alone, wandered the mall's corridors with wide eyes and trembling legs. Each unfamiliar face heightened her panic, and every store she looked at without recognizing the path made her feel even smaller. "Brenda!" Kathleen called again, now with a faint voice, almost without hope of receiving an answer. The noise around her seemed deafening. The sound of footsteps, voices, and announcements mixed into a vague blur that left her even more frightened. She felt her chest tighten, her breathing become short. The fear was overwhelming. She hugged her teddy bear even tighter, as though it was the only thing that kept her safe. Her eyes were teary, and her throat seemed to close up. Meanwhile, Brenda finished her last purchase. She grabbed the shopping bag from the cashier, mentally confirmed she had taken care of everything, and let out a relieved sigh. The weight of the problem she had been carrying all day seemed to finally dissipate. She rushed toward the parking lot, still mentally reviewing her next steps to ensure nothing would slip through the cracks. Her phone, which had previously been an extension of her hands, was now tucked away in her purse. She was exhausted. The day had been long, and all she wanted was to get home, take a hot bath, and forget about the pressure of work for a moment. She unlocked the car with a tap, opened the passenger door, and threw the shopping bags onto the seat. She adjusted the rearview mirror and started the engine. The sound of the radio filled the space with a random song, but Brenda hardly paid attention. She drove back home in silence, still processing everything she had done at the mall. She felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Finally, the day was ending. As soon as she parked in the garage and got out of the car, Brandon appeared at the door of the house. He looked toward the car and frowned when he noticed Brenda was alone. "Where's Kathleen?" Brandon asked, crossing his arms. Brenda, still grabbing the shopping bags from the passenger seat, suddenly froze. Her mind didn't process the question immediately. "What?" Brenda asked, confused. "Kathleen," Brandon repeated, stepping down from the porch. "She didn't go with you?" Brenda's heart stopped for a second. Her eyes widened, and the shopping bag she was holding slipped from her hands, falling to the ground with a muffled thud. The air seemed to leave her lungs. No, it couldn't be. It was a mistake. Her eyes quickly scanned the back seat of the car, as if by some miracle Kathleen would be hiding there. But she wasn't. Brenda's stomach dropped. Her face immediately turned pale. "Oh my God," she murmured, covering her mouth with her hands. Brandon, noticing her reaction, immediately moved forward, his expression full of concern. "Brenda, where's Kathleen?" he asked, his voice taking on a sense of urgency. Brenda opened her mouth to answer, but no words came out. Her whole body began to tremble. She said, almost without voice, I left her at the mall." Brandon's face hardened instantly. "What?" he shouted, his voice filled with shock. "I didn't notice," Brenda cried, her hands covering her face, tears already forming in her eyes. "I thought she was with me. I didn't realize she wasn't in the car when I left." Brandon stood motionless for a second, his gaze fixed on Brenda, as if trying to comprehend the absurdity of the situation. "You left my daughter at the mall?" Brandon screamed, his voice echoing through the garage. "I didn't mean to," Brenda sobbed. "I was distracted. I thought she was with me. I didn't do it on purpose, I swear." Brandon didn't want to hear any more. Without wasting a moment, he grabbed the car keys and, without even looking at Brenda, opened the driver's door. "Get in the car," he said, his voice now quiet but filled with tension. Brenda hesitated for a moment but then obeyed. Her whole body was shaking. She felt like she was about to faint. Once they were both in the car, Brandon started the engine and sped out of the garage at a dangerous speed. The silence inside the vehicle was deafening. Brenda trembled, her hands shaking in her lap. Tears silently streamed down her face. Brandon kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw clenched, his breathing heavy. "She must be terrified," Brenda murmured, her voice barely audible. Brandon didn't respond. "My God," Brenda said, her desperation growing. "What if someone took her? What if she's crying and scared?" Brandon gripped the steering wheel tightly. "I'll never forgive myself," Brenda said, her voice cracking. "Now is not the time for that," Brandon said, finally breaking the silence. "We're going to find her." Brenda closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. The car sped down the road in a rush. Desperation was palpable. As soon as they arrived at the mall, Brandon slammed on the brakes and they both ran out of the car. Brenda's eyes scanned the space, desperately searching. "Kathleen!" Brenda called, running through the hallways. "Kathleen!" Brandon shouted, his voice full of urgency. And then, finally, they saw her. Little Kathleen was sitting on a bench, holding her teddy bear tightly. Her eyes were swollen, and tears silently ran down her face. She looked so fragile, so hurt. Brenda's heart shattered. She ran to the girl, knelt beside her and pulled her into a tight hug, sobbing uncontrollably. "Kathleen, my love, forgive me. Please forgive me," Brenda cried, holding the girl tightly. But Kathleen remained still. She said nothing. She didn't return the hug. After a few seconds, she gently pulled away from her stepmother's arms and stood up. Without looking at Brenda, she walked over to Brandon and clung to him tightly. Brandon immediately wrapped his arms around her, holding her firmly, protecting her. Brenda stood there, kneeling on the floor, feeling the devastating impact of that moment. She had lost something she might never recover. Kathleen's trust. The ride back had been long, even though the journey was short. Each mile seemed to drag along with it a ton of suffocating emotions. Kathleen continued holding her teddy bear, her eyes fixed on the window, saying not a word. Her breathing was silent, but it carried a weight a child shouldn't have to bear. Brenda, on the other hand, tried to hold back her tears, knowing that any words spoken in that moment wouldn't make a difference. When they arrived, Brandon got out of the car first and opened the door for his daughter, who got out without even looking at Brenda. She walked slowly, shoulders slumped, clutching her teddy bear as though it was the only thing that still brought her safety. Brenda hesitated before getting out. Her legs were shaky, as if they could hardly support the weight of the guilt crushing her. Once inside the house, Kathleen went straight to her room. She didn't even say goodbye to her father. She just closed the door behind her and disappeared. Brenda stood frozen in the middle of the room, feeling the cold emptiness around her. Brandon let out a long sigh and ran a hand over his face, visibly exhausted. He sat down on the couch and, after a few seconds, looked at Brenda. His gaze was firm, full of seriousness, but there was no anger. "Sit here," he said, pointing to the couch beside him. Brenda obeyed. Her hands were clasped in her lap, her eyes red from crying. "I know you didn't do this on purpose," Brandon said, his voice calm but heavy. "But that doesn't change what happened." Iggy, Brenda closed her eyes for a moment, feeling another wave of regret wash over her. "I never thought something like this could happen," Brenda said, her voice shaky. "It was a terrible mistake. I was distracted, but that's no excuse. I should have paid attention." Brandon nodded slowly. "Kathleen is hurt," he said. "Did you see how she reacted?" Brenda ran her hands over her face, trying to contain the despair that insisted on coming back. "I lost her trust," Brenda whispered. Brandon was silent for a moment before responding. "Yes," he said bluntly, "but trust can be rebuilt." Brenda looked up at him, full of uncertainty. "How?" Brenda asked. "What do I do?" Brandon took a deep breath before answering. "Words won't help now," he said. "You need to show her. You need to be there. Show her that she can trust you again." Brenda nodded slowly. "I'll do that," Brenda said, determined. "No matter how long it takes, I'll earn her trust back." Brandon watched his wife for a few moments, and then, after a long silence, he placed his hand over hers in a silent gesture of support. From that day on, Brenda changed. The next morning, she asked to reduce her work hours. She began organizing her time better, ensuring she could be more present at home. She started with small gestures. On the first night, she gently knocked on Kathleen's door. "Kathleen," Brenda said, her voice gentle, "I made lasagna. I know you like it." A long silence followed. For a moment, Brenda thought she wouldn't receive a response, but then, very softly, the girl's voice came through the door. "I'm not hungry," Kathleen said. Brenda sighed but kept her composure. "I'll leave a plate in the kitchen in case you change your mind," she said, and left. In the following days, she kept trying. "Do you want help with your homework? Do you need anything? Can I braid your hair today?" But most of the time, Kathleen just shook her head or murmured a soft no. The barrier between them was evident. Even so, Brenda didn't give up. She began creating special moments, hoping that slowly Kathleen would open up again. She prepared her favorite meals. She left little sweet notes in her room. She sat on the couch, patiently waiting for the girl to approach. And then, little by little, small changes began to emerge. One afternoon, while Brenda was making pancakes, she felt a presence beside her. She looked back and saw Kathleen standing there watching her. "It smells good," Kathleen said quietly. Brenda smiled, feeling her heart race. "Do you want to help me flip the pancakes?" Brenda asked. Kathleen hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. It was the first time since everything had happened that they spent time together without the weight of silence between them. After that, small interactions became more frequent. Kathleen started to respond when Brenda spoke. They weren't long conversations, but it was a start. Until one day, while Brenda was finishing organizing the living room, she heard soft steps behind her. She turned around and saw Kathleen holding her teddy bear against her chest. The girl seemed different. Her eyes weren't distant or hurt. There was something peaceful in them. Brenda felt her heart race. Kathleen took a deep breath and, with almost imperceptible delicacy, took a small step forward. Brenda remained still, waiting, respecting the girl's pace. Then, without saying a word, Kathleen came a little closer and rested her head on Brenda's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, small but full of meaning. Brenda felt tears welling up in her eyes. No words were needed. That moment said everything. The weight of guilt she had carried for so long seemed to dissipate. Kathleen had made space to forgive her, not with a speech or a big dramatic gesture, but with a simple touch, with a sincere act of understanding and love. And in that moment, Brenda knew that no matter what happened, she would do everything to never disappoint Kathleen again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.